Cool. Well, I think we're at starting time. So, yeah, this is the talk that you are here for. It's the case study for the Cantor Arts Center redesign. And if that's not the talk you're here for, you're in the wrong place. It's everybody's favorite conference joke. This is me. I'm Ryan Bateman. I'm a senior developer at Hook42. These are all my internet things where you can find me if you want to talk to me, or look at some of my stuff, or go and look at our website. Yeah, that's my face. Oh, yeah, totally. Absolutely. Thanks.
The slides will be up later.
Yeah, we'll have slides online.
How will you be sharing them?
Yeah, just on the
yeah, we'll put them
conference.
on the session page.
All right, and the quality of the projector is questionable. So my name is Kristen. I'm also at Hook42, and various ways of reaching me as well. Been doing Drupal since 2004, and Ryan, you've been quite a while too.
Yeah.
Put you on the spot.
6 years.
All right,
whatever,
not too bad.
2012. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about why they were wanting, the Cantor Arts Center would like to do this redesign. The Cantor Arts Center is on the Stanford campus. If you've never been, and it's an amazing place, and it's free. It's a really spectacular museum. So we'll talk a bit about that. We're going to talk about the technology evaluation. For every project, you're always like, well, it's been 2 months since we've done something. Why don't we see what's going on? Because things change. We'll talk about information and architecture and site building choices. Specifically, there was an importer that needed to happen for events for the site. And we'll talk about some takeaways and some questions.
Cool. So, yeah, just a little bit of background on the project. So, as Kristen mentioned, Cantor is on the Stanford campus. And we basically started working with them with this as their website. So the original site was built in 2006. It was not responsive. There was no CMS. It was all managed through Adobe Contribute, and it was just HTML files, SFTP, like jump in a time machine. That was what we were doing then, and that's sort of where they were. And so obviously they really needed an upgrade, not just in a design sense, but also to like a more modern architecture that actually allowed them to do content entry and have their content team be more productive. And yeah, so they had one staff member who was maintaining this whole website in static HTML files. And so I can only assume that one person is very happy now. We know that they are. So we had a couple of sort of project concerns. So there was a sort of a gap in leadership at Cantor. So there was not within their IT or design staff, but within their like director level management. So it was sometimes difficult for them to get decisions made. So we had some interim marketing directors and a temporary web manager who we were working with. So just making sure that we were giving them something that was not only going to make the current management happy, but something that was going to make everybody happy going forward as well. And then another wrinkle on top of that was that they were previously working with another agency who finished discovery and mock-ups, and then they had to terminate that contract. So we basically inherited some non-responsive mock-ups and not a lot of specs, unfortunately. So those were just a few things that we kind of inherited with the project that were really sort of interesting. But we, despite that, we knew that we could rebuild it because we have technology on our side. And so some of the big concerns that we had for the redesign were that we had this sort of bold, photocentric design. They're an art museum. They have a lot of really striking visual content. But they also had some really specific needs for their content strategy, which meant that they wanted their page layout to be very flexible. They wanted to be able to compose pages in a UI and be able to have really a component-driven strategy that let them, do more than just simply use the same old page templates over and over again. And as Kristen mentioned, we also had an events importer, so we had an integration that we needed to deal with, which was an XML feed that's hosted by Stanford IT. So we needed to be able to consume that and turn that into content for the site. And since they were making a big jump from basically a static HTML site to a new site, we really wanted to say, hey, here's a good opportunity for you to be able to learn about like modern front end technologies. Let's get you on a modern like front end tool chain. Let's see how this is going to be able to help you when you guys inherit the project after we're done. And then lastly, we had some really deliberate image handling. So they have a lot of restrictions on how they can actually use their images because they are getting them on like I'm not sure what the right term is for it.
Yeah,
like
basically, I mean, this is art, and they don't want to misrepresent the art. So whatever photo is there, you can't crop it, you can't modify it. It needs to be. I mean, you can shrink so it's all proportional, but it's really restrictive about like you can't stick on stuff on top of it. This is actually an interesting design because this was the mock-up, but we can't actually do this because this was an art photo, and the fact that they put text on it, actually we weren't able to implement that.
Yeah. So licensing restrictions, because they would get some of these from other galleries and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that led to a bunch of really interesting things where like you can't resample an image. You can't modify it in any way when you render it. So like so much of front-end design ultimately comes down to like cropping things or hiding overflowing stuff because it, if you need to do responsive design, that really helps a lot to be able to do that. So those were some of our sort of big things that we thought about as we were approaching the technology evaluation.
Yeah, and one thing to note is we did give this talk at the Stanford camp back in April, and we had Robert, who is on the Cantor side of the team. He was with us, and we were all three. Well, actually, I wasn't on that one, but three of us that were giving this talk. And at the end of the day, another consideration really was Robert was going to inherit the site. So, there's a lot of sites where we end up doing support afterwards, and we knew going in, and we help them a little bit with support, but for the most part, we needed to make sure that Robert, who's the developer, is going to be happy with this site and is going to be able to, maintain it over time. So that was another thing. So, with every site that we build, everything always changes, right? So, give it a month, and this site was actually built a while ago. At this point, it was about
a year ago.
Yeah, a year or so ago. So, would we do things exactly the same as this? Probably not, right? So every time you're always going through evaluation and saying, what's the newest thing? Hey, Gatsby's pretty hot. Hey, what's that all about? Maybe I should use that, right? So it's very important for every project. You're always taking a look, seeing what's out there. What are people, what's the buzz? Maybe you don't want to jump on the buzz just yet, right? Or, this is, solid buzz. Okay, I might do that one, right? So at the time, Drupal 8 had been out for, a while, and it was pretty solid, so it was a pretty obvious thing. Their team, so mostly Robert, had done quite a bit of WordPress, so the question was, would you want to do WordPress? Because he was already really comfortable with WordPress, they already had it for other sites, and I'm like, should we, would it make sense for you that this was a WordPress site? And there were a number of reasons where he really wanted it to be a Drupal 8 site, which, worked for us because we like Drupal 8. So that was basically going in. We knew that he was happy to have a Drupal 8 site. He was happy to support that. So that was pretty easy. But then, Drupal's flexible. You can do all sorts of things. So then it's more trying to figure out, we've got this content, component model, and there's lots of ways of doing that. What kind of theme? Again, he's going to have to support the site. So we need to, there's some give and take there. And then in the theme, all the interesting things you can do is sort of trying to reuse things. And then also we have this integration with the Stanford Events Feed. So, we had these questions we needed to answer at the beginning of the project. So although there was a discovery that was more of a requirements discovery and that kind of thing that the other agency already went through and they had mock-ups, we were given a bunch of mock-ups, no responsive designs, but a bunch of mock-ups. And we had to kind of go, oh, okay, we had no backstory really with this, and then talk through, okay, based on these, how should we go forward with the technology? So you're always looking Drupal, what are the popular modules now, and are things changing? Is it getting into core, or what are the different things that you need to look at? So standard thing is you're just going to look at the state of core, especially with Drupal 8 having their dot releases every so often of there's cool new stuff. Example, we ended up using the content moderation that was in core because working, I tested it, looked good, they had really simple needs, it was fine. I wasn't going to do Workbench or whatever because it was fine as is. So then you're just trying to figure out, what are the, where is the state of the tech, and what should you use? And we also evaluated. They had another Drupal 8 project at Stanford, which was part of the Stanford Web Services, so the SWS is that. And they were running in parallel with us. Our deadline was a little faster than what they were doing. So we did have an architect call with their team to say, what are you thinking about using? This was going to be their first big in-house Drupal 8 project. And, could we share some ideas, and would it make sense to try to align ourselves a little bit better? So that was part of the initial evaluation. And then we had to say, but what does Cantor need? I mean, Stanford Earth is doing this stuff. Does this work? Is this going to make sense? So these were the things that we were thinking about as we're evaluating the architecture. So, it's always hard to know. Drupal's so flexible. Like, what? I could use this, I could use that, and trying to evaluate, it's always a bit of a challenge, and there's so many modules, but, paragraphs is something that, if you look at talks 2-3 years ago, everything the talk was about paragraphs, right? And then sort of matured, and I was like, okay. And then, it's like, it's kind of a standard thing. A lot of people were using this, right? So sometimes, you just look at that and see what the trend is like for the sessions that are being submitted, the talks that you're going to, that kind of thing. And then also the issue queue, like, how many bugs does this thing have? And, there's a lot of bugs, but, you test it out, you try it out on your local, you watch, conference events online and see, like, is this going to work for me? At the end of the day, I recommend you always tinker with it. On just a throwaway environment, just play around, sandbox, and see if it's gonna work for your needs. So that one wasn't too bad, but for the importer for the events, it was a little bit of a challenge, because in Drupal 7 and previously it was pretty standard to use feeds for an import from some like XML feed, that kind of thing, and feeds was just not there. It was not there. It's still not there, right? So, okay. I stumbled across an article about someone who was using Migrate as a way of importing in this way, and was like, looks good to me. I did a little test, and it was working. I'm like, okay, that's the way we'll do it. So, like I mentioned, we wanted to make sure we didn't go off the rails. Stanford's a big group. They have a lot of Drupal sites, and they have a really solid internal team that does some of their Stanford projects. And so we did this. We just got on calls and tried to make sure, like, okay, what are you guys doing, and does this make sense for us to do something similar? So they actually they were building their own Drupal 8 platform and having lots of components. It was a paragraph space, platform as well, and They were doing great things, but the alignment wasn't quite there. The types of components they wanted didn't really align to the stuff that made sense for the Cantor Arts Center. So at the end of the day, even though it was interesting to talk to them and try to figure out if we could have some overlap, there wasn't a lot of it was more of an understanding that, like, we're also going to use paragraphs, or we're also going to do something similar, but it's not actually going to use the same code base. Now, that said, that's been launched quite a while ago. If it happened today, that might be a different conversation, right? That it was already ready and baked in, and something that might be more considered more heavily. Then, there's this main developer who's at the Cantor Arts Center, and we wanted to make sure, he's going to inherit the site. What do you want? What do you want to make sure that, we do that will make you comfortable going forward? So, he didn't want anything too complicated. Obviously sometimes things get complicated, but, try to keep it, don't over-engineer, try to keep it fairly simple. Obviously follow best practices, which, do that whenever possible. But also one of the things is, historically he used Bootstrap a lot, and he's like, I love Bootstrap, which, I'm no judgments here either way, but yeah, I'm not a front-end person, so, but I'm front-end, I'm sure people have strong opinions one way or another on that, but but that was something that was important to him, like, oh, I really know this, it's comfortable to me, so if that was the choice, then awesome, because I would feel okay in this environment. So, you have to make sure, he was our audience, just as much as people coming to the website were, it's going to be our audience, he was our audience as well. So we're going to go over some of the technology that we chose in the rest of the slides, based on, like the more site building and the integration, and we'll start with information and site building.
Definitely. Yeah, so so we had, we kind of structured this in a way that's just like we're going to talk about problems and the solution that we ultimately came up with. And we've kind of touched on some of this, so it might not be much of a surprise since we've kind of said a lot of the names already. But so we had one kind of big problem, which I mentioned earlier, which is that they really wanted flexible content. They wanted to be able to compose new pages in a way that was able to leverage some existing component types. I'm sorry that this is so washed out, so you can't really tell what any of this actually is. But just maybe take a peek at the Cantor Arts Center website if you want to get a indication. But suffice to say that we needed to be able to build pages in a flexible way. And reuse components across different nodes and pages on the site. And so what we did with that was that we leveraged the UI patterns module. How many people in here are familiar with UI patterns?
Okay. A few.
Cool. Yeah, so UI patterns, it exists in a space that is kind of more Drupal aligned and more Drupal integrated than a lot of other Pattern Lab or atomic design solutions are. You can actually use it without a component library. You can strictly just define components in YAML files. So this diagram here shows it pretty well that you can either use YAML definitions, Fractal, which is another pattern library software, or Pattern Lab. Then UI patterns kind of acts as a glue layer that brings it into any of these supported Drupal integrations. So you can turn your components into something that is like a display mode for views, or is like a display suite with display mode, or it could be exposed as a layout. So your content type could use that as a layout, and then each of the fields that you have on your component is actually a region in that layout, and then also field groups. So it kind of meets you where you build your content, so that worked really, really well for us. And so we used UI patterns, and then we used paragraphs and entity reference, so that we could have our patterns exposed as paragraphs, and then those paragraphs could be placed with inline entity form on a node using entity reference. And we had an interesting situation where we would nest paragraphs. So like if you had a section that was a section of cards, you would create a card section component, and then inside of that create actual card components. So if you haven't tried UI patterns, I would really recommend giving it a shot. There's a really great demo video online from Nuval, I think is the way that you pronounce the agency's name, their European agency that maintains the project. And as far as component design goes, personally, this is like my favorite approach to it. And so this is kind of a generalized demo of sort of what one of their component pages might look like, right? So we have a reference content area where we can actually do like a content reference to something, and it has display modes for different display types. So you can do like a large card or a smaller card, like this 2-column layout, or these like micro-sized cards as well. So all kind of pretty conventional pattern or component design stuff. Like in these orange lines, you can see where we would have nested components. So we might have an image cards paragraph type, and then inside of it 2 image card instances. And this really, to us, had a lot of architectural strengths for us to be able to meet Robert where he wanted to go with his abilities to work with his content team and create flexible content. We could have our page content and node content actually use the same templates, which was really, really useful. We ultimately had to do a lot less template overrides because we were able to reuse that code in multiple places. And then we one thing that I guess that's really, really nice about the UI patterns integration is that actually you can go in and remap a field to a different part of your component in the UI. So you can go in and say, I actually want this field to actually be in the subheading area instead of in the heading area. So if they're able to inherit this and as non-technical users make modifications with the appropriate permissions, obviously. Not every content editor on the site is able to do this, but like Robert is able to do this. He can go in and actually decide, okay, I actually need a new field that has a different character limit or something. Like he can do that without actually having to involve a dev, and that's super, super important for him. And that's something that we really tried to deliver on, and UI patterns helped a lot with. The restricted image handling. So they had all these licensure concerns that we were talking about earlier, and this was a really interesting sort of conundrum for us because, like I said earlier, we needed to be able to do a nice responsive design, but still respect these usage constraints. So no text over the image, no resampling, and no cropping. And so we did go through and use responsive image styles. So we can't resample it, but we did bring in other image sizes. So we were able to actually decrease the image size and serve up different ones at different browser widths using the HTML5 picture tag, which allows you to define at certain min widths a different source image. So you say you have 3 JPEGs called small, medium, and big. Then at various widths, this is a typo, you could have it return these different images. And that helped us a little bit just to keep the page loads fast and also just for general sanity of the theme layer. But this is sort of where we had some interesting things because they're an art museum, and oftentimes artists use strange aspect ratios. If, say, you're a photographer and you do a large landscape shot that's a panorama like this, you need to fit something like this into a card layout that tends to expect an image to be squarish, right? So sort of how are you going to do that with CSS? I mean, and still make this thing look reasonable in all these edge cases. And this is just an example of one scenario that we sort of came up with where, instead we're actually going to have this, just fill either horizontal or vertical space kind of depending on the aspect ratio of the image, which is sort of a pain in the butt to do, actually. So this is what some of the markup actually ends up looking like. You actually just have I think what I think is a pretty conventional markup for a card. You have the heading, the body, and an actual image container with the picture tag, and then in there you have all your image sources. And the real sauce here is this object fit declaration in CSS. You can, if you use this, you can actually have the object kind of make some smart decisions about how it's going to be fit into the nearest parent element that is relatively positioned. And so, but it does need a polyfill for this to work. But just an interesting sort of CSS thing that we ran into for the site was, how the heck do you get these images to look reasonable? Obviously, this layout looks best when you have a square-ish image, but we're able to accommodate some of these edge cases as well. And this is how both of them would look side by side. And so that's just kind of a few of the things that we dealt with there. And then Kristen's going to talk about the events importer and our XML feeds, lack of feeds experiences.
Exactly. All right, cool. So Stanford's huge campus, lots of stuff going on, lots of fun stuff. They have their own, IT, events feed that they maintain, which is a separate thing. And you're able to tap into that, get these XML, RSS, URLs that you can grab information. So, and they have metadata in them, so they could be targeted per organization. So the Cantor Arts Center has, something that's tagged with their events, and they have anything on campus it's going to have. So the geophysics department in this case I was going to have something with the different numbers to tag their events. And then there's all the standard stuff, title, description, all that. But then in some cases, there's a lot of supporting metadata that we also had to pull in, and just understanding that and figuring out the right way to, consume that, and are we displaying it, in the Drupal site or not. One of the interesting things was repeat events and like how to best deal with that, because do you want to, make a new one every time it happens and fill up your database? Maybe not, right? So that was one of the considerations. So, you have a URL where you can grab this information. One of the first challenges was there are different URLs and you get different information depending on which URL you use. And this ended up being the one that was like, oh, that has all the data, and the other one just had a little bit of the data. So, kind of good to have the right source to start with.
That the documentation for their XML feed is practically non-existent.
Yeah, so I had to ask,
just
like,
keep poking around until you find it.
Where's this information? It's not here. So, yeah. So, hey, Robert, what's up? So here's an example of what the XML might look like. I chopped off a bunch because there was a lot, and actually I realized there was PII information in there because it had someone's real email address. I just changed that. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Of course, it's available on the web, so it is in there. So standard stuff. You got a title, organization ID that happens to be theirs, and then when's this event? Is there time? Maybe it's a whole day event. It actually says how long the thing might be and that kind of thing. So had all this information that needed to be parsed out and imported into the Drupal site. So at the end of the day, you look at all these different things that you're trying to grab and try to make some sort of sense out of it. And it kind of bundled into certain groups. So we had a lot of things that were just plain text. It was just, okay, that's easy. There were some that were formatted text that had actually some, markup in it. And there were some things that were kind of like taggy stuff, like categories and keywords, and audiences kind of fell into that. And there was an image usually associated with the event, because if you go to the event site at Stanford, it would actually show an image and have some information about it. A link that actually goes off to the Stanford Events site. And dates. And anyone who's a developer that gets to work with dates from time to time, dates are not fun. There were like 16 different versions of dates, and so anyway, dates are fun.
Yeah, and part of that is that this was manually input information, right? So anytime you get people putting in dates, they use different formats, right?
Sometimes it could be interesting. Yeah. So like I said, there feeds like in Drupal 7 or before, it might be like, oh yeah, this is like slam dunk. I use feeds, I do my little mapping and the UI, and we're good to go. There was no feeds, which is fine. I'm a developer, no problem. So the architecture ended up being that decided to make a custom entity to capture this data from the feed. And it was sort of self-contained. It was a pretty much one-to-one thing. We didn't pull in everything because there were like 16, permutations of dates, and we only needed, some of that. So for the most part, we grabbed most of the data, even if we're like, well, I'm not sure we need that now, but we just tried to pull over anything that might be used in the future, and captured that into a custom entity. And if you're not a programmer, if you're a programmer, you could make a custom entity in code, and that's fine. If you're not a programmer, but you want to make a custom entity, the ECK is pretty cool because you can do that through the UI in order to make one. Then we use the Migrate and Migrate Plus modules in order to actually figure out the migration between the two things, so between the XML and its markup and our custom entity. So this XML bit is going to go to this field, and then there's going to be probably some massaging, unless it's plain text, there'll be some massaging in between the two, especially with the dates. Then you have a cron that's going to run, in this case, daily was fine, and go and run every day, pull the stuff over from the feed and stick it into Drupal. And then there was a really tiny Drupal module that had to do a little bit of massaging, some custom massaging, and then also hook into the cron code. So who here has done migrations before? Okay, a few people. Migrate modules are awesome. They're really great. And Migrate Plus is nice. There's a lot of kind of extra add-ons that you get from that. There's all these, this is not a Migrate talk, but there's some really interesting things that you can do. You get these plugins. So in this case, we were coming from an XML feed, and there is something called Simple XML, which is a plugin that you can use that knows how to deal with XML, right? So we don't have to tell it, this is how you're going to, parse it or whatever. There's already these plugins that you can use in order to pull out what you need. So, we're saying, okay, go off to this URL, the correct URL that we finally found, and then go and parse it. And then this item selector is like, go down within the XML down to this depth of thing and grab the stuff from there. So that was super handy. And then there was dates. And the upshot here was time zones are annoying. And you know what? They didn't really need them. We didn't need them. So I just decided to just get the date and forget the time, because it already actually had a begin time and end time, which was a separate XML field. I'm like, awesome, I don't care anymore. So, sometimes you just simplify the problem and you just grab the date and all was good. If you actually need to pull that in, you can do it. I just got tired and decided it wasn't worth the effort because I already had the information from extra stuff. But there are these plugins. So in this case, a plugin for formatting the date and then, reading in with all this fun letters and syntax in order to read in the format, and then how are you going to write out the format. In my case, I just said, forget about the time. So that was date handling. And so for repeat events, I didn't want to fill up the database. So I just thought, okay, fine, I'm just going to update the information every time there's a new one. So we read over the XML, and it had this particular instance, and for them, in the feed, it actually had all of them. So if it was a repeat event, it had all this information, and we just ended up updating the actual Drupal site to say, okay, there's a new date, rather than having all this repeat information. And then a little bit of date math in order to figure out, how to change the dates within Drupal. But one of the challenging things, really, and I think Ryan alluded to it, was a lot of this stuff is entered by hand by people, and people make mistakes, and people are messy, right? So occasionally it'd be like, why is this thing not showing up right? And it was actually doing the right thing. It's just that somebody had made a mistake and fat-fingered something. So, at the end of the day, sometimes you have to put a little, glue code in there that, okay, well, they didn't do it right, but we'll just sort of adjust for that.
Input validation is very important.
Yeah, that's true. But we don't have any control over that other system, so we're like, we'll just massage it after the fact. So at the end of the day, we had this migrate code running on cron at 1 a.m, and it would create these custom entities with all of the data from the feed and the metadata, and then people on the Cantor site could go in and they can search for events that were Cantor specific and search by different kinds of tags and things like that, including the dates with no times. All right. And we would actually show some of the metadata, not all of it, because not all of it was relevant, but oops, yep. And on that note, yeah. So, all right. Well, Ryan, you talked a little bit about that.
Yeah. We were able to make sure that all of their weird licensure requests were met. So that was really awesome. They're very happy with that, and I think that we're in a good spot for them legally with their images. So it was a fun and interesting experience there.
Yeah, in terms of they've been having all this change and different directions from different leadership, and These success criteria actually came from the developer. He's the one that actually made this slide. So this is not us saying these things, is actually the client, which is kind of nice because we did the talk together before. But he was like, oh, but having the flexibility in order to build the kind of content that the leadership team would like to build has been amazing. And then because they don't know what they're going to want, right? So that has been a really good thing.
Yeah, and they're reporting that their site editors are happy with the new content entry workflow. I think that's to be expected if you're going from
2006
raw HTML to a GUI.
Yeah. And previously they had to actually duplicate so on their old site they'd actually have to take the event information and manually enter it into the Cantor site because they wanted to be able to show that and they didn't have an easy way to do it. Oh, and one thing that we didn't mention is that this is on Pantheon, so it is there's a lot of great hosting options, but this particular one I think was a good fit for it.
Yeah, it worked really well, especially since our primary contact at Cantor, Robert, was he's a developer, but the way that Pantheon it sort of enforces a nice workflow for him really worked well, and I think it was one of the many reasons why we decided that hosting it on Pantheon versus hosting it internally at Stanford was a good idea, and he seems very happy with that as well.
Yeah. And what was nice was we didn't type this. This was actually coming from the client.
Wow.
Give it, yeah. It kind of brought a tear to my eye when I saw that he wrote that. But they had a little less than positive experience previously, and then he wrote that at the end when we gave this at Stanford Camp. So that's really what you want your clients to be saying at the end of the day, or whoever you're building this for is right. We're still friends. It's all good, and we're happy, right? So yeah, that's that. And I think we can entertain some questions.
Yeah. I don't work at Stanford University, Stanford Web Services. I work with the School of Education.
Yeah.
And we're mostly on Drupal 7, but like Drupal 8's an aspiration. I was wondering, is the code available anywhere for the Cantor Arts? That's you can try to like emulate it, or even like I know that there's the regular Drupal login, not the Shibboleth login or WebAuth, etc.
Right.
So the contract's completely ended. There's no interactions anymore? Or?
So, I mean, we still occasionally help out Robert with some stuff, but I'm sure if you called up Robert, he'd be happy to show you and give you a tour of stuff and give you access to things if you wanted to take a look. But there's also the Stanford Web Services that's kind of has their own architecture with paragraphs and that kind of thing, which there's a lot of similarities, but it is a little bit different component architecture.
They're using UI patterns as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, exactly.
So there are actually some pretty deep similarities in the way that we did things. At that time, unfortunately, they weren't done with the work on their pattern lab stuff, and they were actually maintaining an active fork of UI patterns.
What is Robert's last name?
Diarmond?
Yeah. Actually, that's a really good point, which I didn't point out earlier, was the Stanford Web Service says, so we were trying to decide, UI patterns, no, it was still pretty green, and, you're always a little nervous to bite the bullet, especially if it's for a client, if it's internal stuff, that's different, right? But for a client of whether this is the right approach. And talking with Stanford Web Services, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to use UI patterns. I'm like, okay, then that's a safe one. We can do that and no problem. Or they're not going to be like, whoa, what did you do here, right?
Yeah.
So that's certainly, it's good to kind of keep on the same page as people. All right, any other questions?
Moving from a D7 to a D8 site. D7, sorry. The site uses feeds heavily. And I'm interested in your experience using Migrate as a replacement for feeds. Obviously, this D7 to D8 has used Migrate extensively to migrate our content.
Right.
Developed a lot of familiarity with the tool. I think it's awesome. What was it like to use it as a feeds replacement?
Personally, I'm a programmer, so it was great. Like I could get anything done except for that one annoying thing with the time where I'm like, okay, fine, they don't need it anyway, so I just kind of, it just made the
that's a
problem
broader-
made the problem go away. So, but and I'm sure if I would have, just spent a little more time on it, I could have, decided to pull that in as well. But yeah, on the whole, all of the plugins, there's just so many plugins you can just if you're wondering, well, how do I get this format over, and you just Google it, like there's someone's made a plugin for it, so it's really, really straightforward. And I personally, really like the Migrate, and Migrate Plus was like the plus, the plus for that.
And I think especially if you're using Migrate and are just using their built-in source and process plugins, it's incredibly easy. I mean, you can write a really powerful importer for any kind of REST API that's publicly available on the internet with very few lines of code. It's actually really pretty amazing. I at this point I don't think I would probably even use feeds if the port finished, because I'm convinced that the Migrate way of doing things is actually really great.
Were you migrating directly into the entity?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The event entity, or were you
Yeah.
doing intermediary step?
No, there was a little bit of an intermediary in the sense that we made an architecture decision to have a custom entity, which was kind of a one-to-one mapping between the XML. There is actually a content type as well, which points to that entity, and it was decoupled a little bit because they wanted to be able to add extra information.
And that's why you said by association.
Yeah, so I was like, well, we could have them mucking with it, but I was afraid they would break something, so I really kept that as a separate thing. That, okay, this is the stuff we're pulling over. You can look at that and point to it, but you can't mess with that. You can just go and kind of add on within the content type as well, because they had the flexible content. They could actually add some flexible content within their event page, and that points to the custom entity.
So the import includes a reference automatically to another entity that is to be edited by it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
we auto-generate a node on the fly
Nice.
while it's made over, and if the node's already there because it happened to be updated because it's a repeat event or something, then it just it's just there by default.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think we missed her.
yeah.
Oh, I was actually wondering if you could speak to how the handoff went, especially using a flexible model. That's always great until sometimes it gets used in ways you didn't expect. So I was just wondering how that went, if you had any strategies of making that more successful.
Yeah, so we did a lot of hands-on time with Robert, just training him on how to use the system. And actually, one thing that we didn't talk about in the presentation is that they did a lot of manual content migration because they wanted an opportunity to actually go through and do a lot of content edits. So for them, it worked really well to do a content entry. So we were actually doing active development while content entry was happening, and so there was a lot of opportunity for him to sort of get training on the fly on how we were developing the component system. And then as far as the handoff beyond that, and then he sort of propagated that out to the rest of the content team over at Cantor. But generally, it seemed like he picked up really quickly on the
And that was actually a good point, because we were building stuff and then they're trying it out and they're like, oh, could you make one more component because we have this, and then at that point we already had all the scaffolding, we had a bunch of stuff, and it was like to drop in something else, it was pretty trivial just to add another little thing, right? So and then it was like they were actively actually using it and building it, so it was a relevant thing to add, not just we might want this someday thing.
Right.
Yeah, we could really iterate on the components really quickly, because as he used them, he would say oh yeah, this might be nice for it to have actually some different requirements for this field, or I need to be able to put more text there, or whatever.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great question though.
Okay.
Could you say a little more about the image rights and what you weren't able to do and how you worked around it? I understand not cropping, and I understand not writing text across it, but I don't understand not resampling.
Yeah, and the resampling, my understanding is that it's not, you can use the image if it has been downsized, but the resolution must, the DPI has to remain the same. You can't take it and make it
grainy.
Yeah, you can't.
Grainy, you could, yeah.
Right, so you could reduce the actual pixel dimensions of the image, but so long as the DPI remained high enough, then you're fine. Basically a quality constraint. So I did a bad job of explaining that, so thank you for asking.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.